Welcome to Trust the Badge. In this episode, I interview Miss Kathleen Diaz, who is a monthly columnist for Police1, where she writes a column called Policing the Remote and Rural. Miss Diaz is also the admin of several social media accounts under the name of the Rural Badge, where she writes under the pen name Charlie Pitt. With her extensive experience and perspective on rural law enforcement, she advocates for the issues and challenges faced by law enforcement in remote and rural areas. Make sure to read her blog posts on LinkedIn and her articles on Police1, which will be linked in the description of this episode. Welcome, Ms. Diaz.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Diaz. I am a monthly columnist for Police1. I write a column called Policing the Remote and Rural, and I'm also the admin of several social media accounts under the name of the Rural Badge. And on those accounts, I write under the pen name Charlie Pitt. There's a blog of the same name, sadly neglected at the moment, but one of these days things will get normal, right? And then I'll be able to pick that back up again.
Well, thank you so much again for being here, Ms. Diaz. I really appreciate your time, and I know you're really busy writing all the time, and you write such great articles. TheRuralBadge.com, is it? Your
It
web?
is
Okay.
therealbank.com. And then there's a Facebook page and an Instagram account under the same name.
Okay. How did you begin your career in writing, and what led you to focus on rural law enforcement?
I started out writing about rural law enforcement actually on social media in 2016 when I stood up the Facebook page called the Rural Badge. And that actually arose out of a lot of frustration with conversations, believe it or not, on a police wives forum before there was the internet. I really didn't know a lot of other police wives to talk with or share experiences with because of the rural and remote nature of where we lived and my husband worked. But once I was able to connect with them on this forum, I realized that a lot of the conversations we were having were really not about the same thing at all.
Okay.
And the more news I was able to follow, the more I realized their stories were going completely untold. So I wanted to fill that gap.
Okay. And you've been going for quite a while now, since 2016, right?
That's correct.
I've read your articles. They're all great. And it's really insightful to see what there is in the rural community of law enforcement as it's not discussed as much. We'll get more into that later. But what experiences have most influenced your perspective on rural policing?
I have to say that it's our family's experiences.
Okay.
I'm not the law enforcement officer in the family, and I know that's fairly unusual for your podcast guests.
No, no,
I'm a,
no.
I'm I'm a cop's wife,
Okay. Yeah.
and
I'm not a cop either.
we don't get to have a voice.
Yeah.
We don't get to have a voice a lot of times. We're expected to just kind of stay in the background and not do anything that's going to make stuff worse. Um, but we see everything and we live it right alongside with them. And the things that they struggle with affect the family. And being able to, as I've gotten older and as we've gotten more distance from his career, my husband retired in 2019, and that's also when I started writing for Police1 as a regular columnist. The more openly I can advocate for other officers who are running into the same issues we are, which are pretty much the same things urban officers run into, but the scale is different. There can be kind of a competition. I think that's
Right.
natural for humans to, okay, but what you're experiencing isn't anything like. And I try to get away from that as much as I can because it's not a competition. They're parallel universes. And sometimes
Yes.
they intersect, but it's really two different worlds, but dealing with the
Okay.
same
Yeah,
sort of
that's a really interesting perspective to put it as. And before we get into more about rural law enforcement and how that's a bit different than urban policing, you were actually a teacher and marketer before you started writing, correct?
That's correct. It was not a full-time credential teacher. And this goes back to part of the rural stuff too. I was a substitute teacher in high schools, in public high schools for about 30 years. There were a few stretches of time where I had to take full-time work regardless of the pay or whatever. And so I have worked as a recruiter for the California Conservation Corps. I worked in outside sales, selling print advertising for print publications, wrote and edited for a or travel publication. But I started substitute teaching when I married my husband in the 80s, and I was a brand new college graduate with a brand new business degree. And I'd worked retail for years, and I wanted to get into the real working world. And then I married this deputy who worked in a mountain county in the
Yeah.
Sierras and moved to a very small town and discovered that the pay scales, first of all, were
Wow.
abominable, like less than I had been making working retail in Alabama.
Yeah.
and and also the hours where they were available, even at that very low pay, were completely opposite my husband's
Wow.
schedule because he worked nights and his days off were always in the middle of the week because he was a young officer. And I discovered that I actually liked substitute teaching. I like doing something different every day. I like teaching, and the hours are
Okay.
flexible. So I could make myself available only during his off time, or at least to make myself available more often when he was
Okay.
around.
And with that experience, how has your background in teaching and marketing contributed to advocating for rural law enforcement?
Well, advocacy is really a communications
Right.
game. It's about talking. It's about teaching, and specifically about storytelling because you can be, for instance, a researcher and you can accumulate a lot of numbers and a lot of data, and it's super dry when you present it to people. And unless they're already interested in the topic, they're going to nod politely, perhaps, and then ignore what you had to say. But if you can tell them a story,
Okay.
if you can teach them why it matters, what you're saying, not just the what, but the why, you've got a lot better opportunity to kind of draw them in. And honestly, this is one of the places where I see a lot of officers who are communicating publicly and a lot of department heads that are, say, struggling, like with the county administration or something like that. Um, they have all the information and they know what they know, but they don't know how to convey that to someone else in a way that that other person can grasp and that makes it important to them as well. And that's really what web teaching and marketing are.
Right. And as you can see, you've done a great job so far with writing and giving out these stories because, as I know, you write stories about some like rural deputies and officers that are not really out there. What are some of the more interesting ones that you've written about so far, you'd
Like,
say?
as far as news cases or, like, the personal type stuff is in the blog posts, which because the stuff that I post, like, on social media is really different from what I write for Police1.
Right. But what about some like news cases that you find? Because as you know, the media today doesn't cover rural policing as much as you think it would, or give any voice to law enforcement at all. What would you say is more of the interesting one that you would hope more people knew about, like a news case?
Um, in particular, in news cases, a lot of times I will go back, to history, both recent and way back, because that's where things like policies and training are based.
Right.
And the more I read and the more I talk to people, I've discovered cases like the Colebrook murders in New Hampshire that resulted in a shootout with a sovereign citizen that resulted in two state troopers, a judge, and a newspaper editor murdered, and multiple other officers from Border Patrol to New Hampshire Fish and Game wounded. By the end of the day, this was a gun battle that went on over state lines and it was completely eclipsed by the North Hollywood bank robbery because it happened the same year, and because it happened in a really tiny town, even though the crime in North Hollywood was just photogenically spectacular, and it was live streamed in the very early stages of what that meant, and there was a lot of bloodshed, but no officers died that day. On the other hand, there were big news channels there to cover it live. The Los Angeles Times was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of it,
Mhm.
whereas the Colbrook newspaper, their editor was actually killed in their parking lot in the middle of this incident, and the news staff continued to cover it and put out a paper
Wow.
that day. while the yellow tape was still up in their program, they were also nominated for the same Pulitzer, but they were shut out by the LA Times. And in a way, you can't really blame people when they don't even know that a place the size of Holbrook exists,
Right.
right? And LA is just huge. It's everything. It's Hollywood. It's, on TV. It's in the news. They write TV shows about it, and people base entire novel series and in places like that. Um, and there just aren't enough eyeballs on it. One of my other articles that took a lot of research, but I really, really enjoyed talking to people and putting it together was about gun battles that took place in rural and remote areas, like Namely Hot Springs, Alaska, and one on a guerrilla wheat grow in California in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where a game warden was wounded, and uh, those sorts of things. And again, yeah, the Colbert martyrs uh, that resulted in changes in training and perspective and policy for the agencies where they work. Those are the sorts of things that most people haven't heard about unless they're already involved with those agencies, or, for instance, maybe if they go up and they fish and they hunt in Alaska, they might know where Manly Hot Springs is, but they're not going to know that the first gun battle involving an aerial platform, so snipers on a helicopter
Right.
in a law enforcement capacity, took place right there in that middle of nowhere place.
This is why it's good to have people like you who write about this and who talk about this on social media because most of what you just said I have never heard of, and I'm sure other people also have not, just because of how rural policing is not talked about as much today, and even law enforcement in general. Which really transitions well into the next question, which is what challenges are more prevalent in rural law enforcement compared to urban law enforcement?
Money is so boring, but it's always at the top of the list.
Right.
Funding is very difficult. When you work in a small area, your tax base is smaller. If you live out west where there are huge tracts of land that are publicly owned, those publicly owned lands are not subject to property taxes. So if that's what your funding is based on, you're already against the wall there.
Yeah.
Staffing is another one. Staffing is a problem in town, but it's not as big an issue if, for instance, you have multiple other towns within just a few minutes driving distance. But that's where the remote part comes into play. If you have a large distance to cover and you've only got a couple people patrolling it, for instance, the county where my husband retired is 3,000 square miles. It's not unusual for one or two patrol deputies to be patrolling solo for the entire county.
Oh, shoot.
So,
2 or 3. Wow. Okay.
no, one or two.
Oh, 1 or 2. Sorry, 1 or 2. That's
And so if they have backup, it's going to be from highway patrol, from fish and game,
for a different
forestry,
department,
law
right?
enforcement, and the distances that they're going to have to cover are going to be enormous. It's not unusual for someone to drive code 3 for hours to get where they're going. Uh, so those are really big ones. Isolation is another one, and that's one I haven't written about that I want to at some point.
Okay.
That just being very far from resources, whether it's medical or counseling or groceries.
I expected some of those just because of how small rural places can be. Of course, the tax is gonna be less and the pay is gonna be less, but the other issues you mentioned, that's a huge issue, especially if you're a rural police officer and say that there's a really bad situation going on and you need backup, you're gonna have to wait a good amount of time before another agency can send one of their officers to help you. So it's a really big situation that I hope can be resolved in the future. Do you know any rural police departments that are dealing with this issue as of right now and are trying to resolve it? Or is it more of like more departments are facing this issue and it's really hard to solve?
They're facing the issue, and it's really hard to solve.
Okay.
And I always had some thoughts about things that can help, but they're not always ones that translate well in our modern setting right now because of the nature of law enforcement in the United States. Being highly individual, highly separate, um, layered, and
Mhm.
layered in ways that they don't always talk to each other, communicate with each other, let alone want to collaborate in things like administration and dispatching and stuff like that. The emphasis that is on local control and local funding is completely understandable given the history of our nation. But I think sometimes it works to the disadvantage of the individual officer that's out on the street.
When it comes to rural policing, I'm sure there are a bunch of myths out there about rural police officers and what you see in movies. What myths about rural policing is inaccurate and what would you say is true?
Um, there's so many myths. Um, the biggest one is there's a hashtag that I use on my social media, and it's Mayberry's a myth. And that's because, especially if you're, say, older than 40, um, the go-to is always, Sheriff Andy Taylor in his little town of Mayberry with his one patrol car and his one deputy. And, Andy Taylor never carries a gun because he just doesn't need to here in
Right.
Mayberry. It's perfectly okay for him to just enforce the law solely through the force of his personality and the
Right.
respect people have for the law.
I wish.
Um, and the thing is, getting across to people, especially people who are decision makers for law enforcement, so city and county administrators, those who make their budgets, those who vote on their funding, that Mayberry was fiction and it never existed.
Okay.
And no matter how nice you think your little town is, all
Right.
the place where bad things happen is more than one person.
Sure.
And it does. And, I find that that myth adversely affects a lot of rural law enforcement because it's used as a reason to keep their funding below the levels they need it to be, to make it harder than it needs to be for them to get to modern training, to be staffed at appropriate levels. I hear fairly regularly from officers who not only are buying their own uniforms, but still are not issued basic safety equipment like body armor and tourniquet. And a
Yeah.
lot of it has to do with, I mean, I talked to a police chief the other day who said a decision maker seriously looked him in the face, said, I know you guys aren't paid very well, but at least nothing, you're really unlikely to ever get hurt here. So we really
Wow.
don't need to do it at those kinds of levels. And, the idea that that person has to sit there and kind of just bite their tongue because they can't alienate this person they need
Right.
to authorize their next budget. I'm under no such constraints. So,
That's a great point that you brought up because I remember just because of how crazy I thought it was in my second interview. By the way, this is going to be my like 26th or 27th interview for Trust the Badge. But my second interview, I was still starting and I went to this airport where I interviewed like three police officers from the airport police. And I talked to them to see how it's sort of different for them because as they're airport police, not city police. And you know how jurisdictions are different. And I was talking to them
mhm,
and they talked to some of them. They all came from different jurisdictions. They all finally came here. They never started there. They came from different police departments across the country and they came to this airport to work here. I was talking to one of them. He talked about how he wouldn't name the specific department for reasons. And the department he went to after he was done with training and he was hired and everything, he had to buy his uniform, his gear, his guns, like everything. And the and he said he wasn't even getting paid enough to buy all of that stuff while trying to live and have a house to pay for. So it was very disturbing to hear that these police officers in underfunded police departments or even police departments who don't get the funding they deserve have to pay for their own equipment when they simply can't afford enough of it. But it's really disturbing to find out that's the reality for a lot of officers today.
it is. And, because of the stuff that I write, I've become kind of a safe place to vent for officers on social media and stuff like that. They know I won't ever quote them without permission. They know I won't ever ID them if I do quote them with their permission unless they expressly say so. I've heard from officers who have just lost friends in car wrecks uh, because the patrol car they were driving had bald tires and slick brakes. And they knew it, their boss knew it, the admin knew it, and it just wasn't considered enough of a priority to fix
Wow.
something that basic.
That
Uh,
important for policing itself. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like that's not even a policing issue.
It's
That's a
just
workplace safety issue.
right.
And it's just, yeah, well, if you weren't good breaks, I guess you better go to a bigger department. It's like, that's not how that's supposed to work at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Which actually translates as well to my, next question, because I wanna talk about the communities of those rural police,
Sure.
departments. How well do they tend to trust their police departments? Is it more of, like, the story you just gave of how people are like, "Oh, hey, sheriff, I know you don't have a gun, but I'll listen to what you say," or, like, you know how it's like in those good old movies where it's like everyone just likes each other, respects
Yeah.
each other, the sheriff, there's, like, one sheriff and one little assistant deputy going around, or is it completely opposite? So how
It,
does the 10 trust.
I think it's somewhere in between. I think there's probably a higher level of trust in small communities where the officers, of course, are trustworthy.
Right.
There is, if you treat people respectfully yourself, you're less likely to get pushback. Let's put it that way. But just because there's more daily contact,
Mhm.
especially if it's a place where the officer can afford to live in the community where they work, you do just have a tendency to have a different sort of a relationship with your community when there's only one grocery store and your spouse may be standing in line for groceries with
Yes.
everybody else, where there's only one school and your kids are going to be going to school potentially with the children of everyone you've ever arrested. Um, that sort of thing. You are their little league coach. You go to church with them, or your auntie does, or somebody. It's a completely different sort of a dynamic. It doesn't mean that it's always positive.
Right.
But one of the other articles that I wrote for Police1 that actually came out of a Facebook post where I just threw out this question. I said, "What's some stuff that you guys know that urban police don't?" And it
Okay.
turned into this marvelous, enormous thread
Wow.
on de-escalation, even though that's not what anybody would have called it when they were just talking. And I turned that into a column about what rural cops know about de-escalation. That it's like this hot new buzzword in the city,
Yep.
and it's like, hey, you know what? If you know that next week the guy you arrested for drunk last week may be your only possibility of backup in a fight, you're probably going to talk to him a little bit differently
Yeah.
when you're hooking him up that first time. And that is actually something that's happened with my husband.
Oh,
Ages ago, there was a guy he had arrested for drunk in public, hooked him up, took him to jail. The guy sobered up, bonded out, and they had a pending court case. And Dan was in a knockdown, drag out with some guy on the street. Same guy walks up to him. Hey, Danny, you need help? Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. No. And once the scuffle was over, hey, you treated me fair. I'm good. And just wanders away with, he's still got a pending court
yeah.
case. But it was just a different sort of a dynamic. I've had neighbors come and knock on my door. Can can I talk to him because I'm really mad at this other neighbor and I want to know how much trouble I'm going to be in if I hit him? Okay, first, please don't do
Right.
that. And second, no, he's asleep because he worked graveyards and I'm not waking him up. So guess I got to talk to that
Yeah.
guy. But that's the thing is they know where you live.
Right. And everyone's very connected.
They- It is. And so, there has to be a different sort of a relationship. Um, we've still had hostile people try to follow my husband home, or people that are angry with him or somebody he works with or some incident that, we still had surveillance cameras and motion detector lights on our house. But it wasn't like a local gangbanger or a drug dealer. They were like a lot of times sovereign citizens or militia sorts and that sort of thing that were angry with, law enforcement for one issue or another.
And that's interesting you brought up de-escalation because a lot of the time people would think that urban police officers have better training because they have more access to resources that rural police officers don't. Is that really the case, would you say?
It that's one of those, well, it depends,
Okay.
sort of things. Some bosses are better at finding ways to get their people training regardless of budget than others. But not all things like de-escalation are a result of training. Some of them are a result of workplace culture
Okay.
and community relationship, you know, learning that if you're all by yourself in the middle of nowhere and no one is coming to help you is going to make you much more willing to talk than to fight, you know?
Yeah.
Develop that silver tongue and some communication skills. Hey, wait. What about, where if you know you can hit a button and 12 people are going to be there in the next minute, how much incentive do you have to de-escalate, really?
What else is something that you wish more people knew about rural law enforcement that not many know about?
One of them really has to do with a research project that I've been working on solo since 2019. I maintain a spreadsheet new every year of every place in the country where officers get shot, shootings rather than other forms of assault, solely because they're easier to track and harder to dispute intent. Um, and then I break that spreadsheet down by population.
Okay.
So, every to me, I just like arbitrarily decided that everything over 30,000 people is too big for me to track. And then I break it down from about 11,000 to 30,000 and then below 11,000 population. And so I track how many officers every year get shot, how many of them die, how many are arrest saves, and where it happened. And then I've been tracking how many of those are rural officers because again, that imagination that nothing ever happens in small places, that rural cops aren't likely to get hurt, they're not likely to get killed in the line of duty, um, is it's very pervasive and it's used as a reason again to deny funding, to deny training, to deny equipment in a place where things like working comms could make a huge difference. And the numbers were exactly what I thought they would be, and in some cases worse, actually. There has not been a year, this is the sixth year I've been tracking them. In no year has it been less than 30% of the officers shot that were from rural areas. In no year has it been less than 25% of the officers who died as a result of felonious gunfire. Um, and the last 2 years, actually, the fatality rates were over 50%.
Okay.
So the number of rural officers who were killed in the line of duty by felonious gunfire was 50% or more of the total nationwide.
Those are some scary
And
statistics.
exactly. And so, yes, you might look at one individual officer at one individual department in any given place and say, there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. The odds of that individual officer getting hurt or killed are infinitesimally small.
Mhm.
But when you look at it as a whole, nationwide, the risk is actually significant. And I believe it no for no other reason, rural officers need and deserve professional, modern levels of equipment, of staffing, of funding, of training. So
Okay. Thank you for sharing that because that's obviously not known as much as you wish people would know about the fact that these rural police officers have more, like you said, more than a 30% chance of getting shot at in the line of duty. And it's very disturbing to know that nothing's really being done about it. The media's, of course, not like covering it, but that it's something that needs to be discussed more and hopefully can be prevented. I hope your research project goes well and you're still working on it, right?
I am. This is something I've
Okay.
been doing since 2019. And if you want to see the progression of it, I have written a column about it every May
Okay.
uh, in Police1 with that year's statistics. And then as it went on with a comparison with previous years. So probably the easiest would be to start with May 2024 and work backwards because all of my spreadsheets and all of the other data that I'm using are all linked in those columns.
What about technology? So, as you know, technology has changed law enforcement in every part of the nation since body cameras came out, since like all this technology or the gun cameras that you put on guns nowadays. How has it changed rural law enforcement? I would honestly expect it to help them, but from what it's looking like, the amount of officers getting shot and the amount of officers even dying in rural communities it's really sad to see what's going on. How do you think technology has developed in rural communities?
Slowly,
Slowly?
but it is happening. Even a lot of very small departments have body cameras, or
Okay.
at least dash cameras now. Um, Even in some of the areas that are more progressive in the progress way, not in the political way, in their use of workplace safety regulation and things like that. I think it's more so.
Mhm.
I knew several very small departments that made really excellent use of them in California. And I have to say, even going back to the 80s, uh, my friend and several other officers that I knew started using recording devices that they bought back when it was micro cassette recorders. And
Okay.
they consider him both an insurance policy and absolutely invaluable in court. I think one of the newer technologies that offer a ton of potential, and some fairly small departments are making really good use of them, is drones.
Yes.
And it's not as widespread as it could be yet, but it's an absolute force multiplier. It's an extra set of eyes. It's fantastic for search and rescue. It's fantastic for advance intel before standoffs or warrant arrests.
Right.
And I've even seen a few papers, and one of them was from an officer from a smaller department speculating how drones that automatically deploy in the way body cameras or gun cameras automatically turn on
Right.
could be a fantastic thing for a solo officer who knows there's no
Absolutely.
backup. But if as soon as he steps out of his car or as soon as he stops, the drone goes up and can see 360,
Mhm.
that's still, this much of science fiction, but also that close to being a thing. And that could be a huge deal because one of my theories for why so many rural officers who do get hurt die and why there seems to be a disproportionate number of them who are attacked is just because they are alone.
Yeah.
So if everybody they dealt with knew for sure that there was an extra set of eyeballs, whether it was going back to, a joint real-time crime center that they're working with other people, so somewhere there is a dispatcher that's watching their body camera or watching that drone footage, whatever. I think it would have to have some sort of an effect. Can't prove it, but I don't see why it wouldn't.
Okay. And you have personally seen how this technology has transformed rural policing, right? I'm sure because body cams and dash cams, would you say is one of the more revolutionary pieces of technology for law enforcement in rural communities?
I think it was, and it's not new technology anymore, but it is still new to a lot of agencies. One of the aspects of body cam footage that really gets overlooked when we're talking about small and rural departments is how much IT support they require
Okay.
and the money that's involved in storing, retrieving, and redacting the data when it's required for court or anything like that. I mean, it's really an enormous task.
Okay.
And in a lot of larger departments, you will have entire staff that's devoted to that. And if you've got, a chief and for officers, who's going to do that?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
even if they want to use it, that may be a roadblock. They may not be able to get their small town to pay for the storage, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue that I think needs to be addressed as well because the technology like sure you can have the technology for the cameras and all of that, but actually handling it, managing how to get the
Yeah.
videos and the footage, that's a whole nother
That,
process that requires someone else to
yeah.
deal with. Yeah.
And that's the thing is actually just accessing the body cameras themselves and making them work. That's actually the easy part.
Okay. Yeah. You're right. And what would you say are the most pressing issues for rural law enforcement today? I know we discussed some issues so far, but what would you say are your top two, top
Yeah.
three? most pressing issues?
For the line officers themselves, I would say access to appropriate safety
Okay.
equipment and training. Um, I would also say some level of workplace protections because a lot of the smallest uh, agencies work without support in states where at will employment is the law. And if you have a great boss and a good administration, then that is absolutely no problem. If you work in a place with slightly shakier grasp of
Mhm.
ethics and integrity, that can really impact an officer's ability
Okay.
to enforce the law objectively. And I think you can end up with a lot of churn that way because they're one wrong arrest of the wrong person away from hitting the
Right.
unemployment line. And that's one of those things that really doesn't get a lot of play. But again, that's something that we have seen firsthand, both with us and with people in our immediate circle, can really be an impact. And you don't see that in larger agencies, mostly because they have some power in numbers. And a lot of them have access to, if not unions, strong unions, then civil service and protections. And a lot of rural agencies, a lot of smaller agencies don't have that.
Thank you for sharing because those are definitely some issues that need to be addressed more. Again, you brought so much insight and so many issues that I've personally never would have thought of when it comes to rural policing, but it is true, as you said. I wish it would be dealt with more. Do you know any if there are any nonprofits or if there are any sort of agencies or organizations out there that are trying to deal with these issues, or do you think that it should start to happen more?
Um, we definitely need more because one of the problems is there are so many of them. It's hard to get them united to gain any traction with things that say need to be addressed legislatively. There is one nonprofit agency goes by it's called Surlia. It's the Small and Rural Law Enforcement Executive Association. And that is one of those things that was just actually formed to try and get some strength in numbers for political advocacy, to help provide resources to agencies that can't do it on their own. There are a couple other places where um, some training at the federal level. They're starting to notice that the smaller agencies are struggling and they're starting to find ways to bring them in, either helping them finance travel to or taking training to the departments as long as they can provide a venue and some extra bodies from other agencies. Um, I think they're starting to notice that. I'm starting to see it in some of the publications that I read from yearly from the FBI and the DOJ and stuff like that. That oh wait, we don't even have a proper definition of what rural is. Maybe we should look at that and see,
Yeah.
what fits within that category.
Mhm.
That kind of thing. So.
Okay. And I really appreciate how you're very passionate about what you speak about, what you write about, what you post about. What keeps you so motivated and passionate about your work for about 8 years now?
For personal life experience, working and living in progressively smaller and more remote places, seeing the obstacles that were thrown into our way, and also my personal feeling
Yeah.
of having been silenced
Okay.
for many, many years. I couldn't speak up for fear of adversely impacting um, my husband's career or someone else's, a friend, seeing someone treated unfairly, unjustly, someone getting hurt unnecessarily, and not being able to do anything about it. The gotcha file in my email,
Sure. Yeah.
for someday when it wouldn't matter anymore. And one of the blessings that comes with age as a cop's wife is I don't care anymore. I don't have
That's
to
great.
be afraid of making somebody mad. I don't have to be afraid of stepping on toes. He's retired. I don't have to worry about impacting his career anymore. And so it's
Right.
almost, well, it's not almost like, it's exactly like all that stuff I stored up all these
Hmm.
years, I couldn't say anything about, or just pouring out the keyboard and sometimes through a microphone.
Great for you. I mean, this is why I have Trust the Badge for not only current law enforcement, but for people like you who genuinely want to speak about these pressing issues that are not talked about today and give a voice to law enforcement, even those in rural communities who are not talked about as much. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
Just how much I appreciate you and how much I appreciate this invitation,
Thank you.
especially because you don't have any personal connection with the law enforcement. That makes you a very believable and viable voice. You can't be accused of ulterior motives. You're just interested and you
Right.
want to learn.
I was purely sparked by what happened as I explained while you interviewed me. This is just what I want to cover and what I want to talk about more because,
Yeah.
as you know, it's not talked about.
Well, and again, you, like me, have an opportunity to speak up and say things that the officers can't say for themselves. And
Right.
it is so, so much needed.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. And I will continue to do Trust the Badge. As you know, this is not just something where I'm going to be like, oh, I'm headed to college. I'm done. I will continue Trust the Badge. I will continue what I'm doing. And I hope to see a lot of progress with it. I'm looking forward to spreading Trust the Badge to my college campus and to see what can be done with like a student organization or something to have more students come together and realize how much of an issue it is that communities aren't trusting police, the fact that police aren't given a voice in today's media, and the fact that law enforcement, they need help right now more than ever. So I hope to continue it. And thank you so much for your time for actually speaking about rural police. This is the first ever episode I've had about rural police and someone talking about rural police. And it's good to know that there are people out there like you who recognize the issues at hand. So thank you so much, Ms. Diaz.
I appreciate the time.
Of
I
course.
appreciate the time, and I'm looking forward to good things from you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. And just one more time, anyone listening to this interview could find you on LinkedIn on the Rural Badge, correct?
And at Police1.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you so much again and have a great day. Thank you for listening to this episode of Trust the Badge. Please follow at Trust the Badge on Instagram for updates and follow Trust the Badge on any podcast platform such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.